Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is truly an honor to be here before this committee and to be back in New Hampshire. I only wish that the committee treats me kinder than the voters of New Hampshire did in 2012. We got a lot of support, but not quite enough. It's great to be here, and I want to do my best to try to answer maybe even some of the questions that have been asked here. I just want to give you a little bit of a background as to how I got involved. And when I was asked about this issue, actually it was during the 2012 campaign, I knew nothing about it. I'm a lawyer. I was in Congress and the Senate for 16 years and knew nothing about Article 5 and really didn't even realize that state legislatures could propose amendments because it was nothing I'd ever heard before. And so my initial reaction was, as being a conservative, was, let's just say, very skeptical. Well, if it hadn't been done for 240 years, why are we thinking about doing it now? And so I really had the position of really not being a supporter of it. And it wasn't until later on, and I remind the committee that when I was running for president in 2011 here in New Hampshire in 12, the federal deficit, federal debt was $14 trillion. I mean, that doesn't seem that long ago that I was up here campaigning and it was 14 trillion. It's almost 35, 36 trillion dollars now. Every 4 months, we're adding $1 trillion to the national debt. I just ask any of you, and I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, if we continue this, are we not headed to a fiscal crisis? And do you see anybody, either party, both parties are guilty here. Do you see either party doing anything in Washington, D.C. to stop the accumulation of debt and the collapse of our financial system? Does anyone believe that's not going to happen? Okay, I don't see any hands going up. So when people tell me, well, there's a risk if we do a convention of states. Well, if the alternative is fiscal collapse as a certainty, what's the risk? If your house across the street is burning and you have to cross the street to put the fire out, there's a risk of crossing the street. There is. Their car could be coming by. It could hit you. Bad things can happen if you cross the street. But if your house is burning, you cross the darn street. Ladies and gentlemen, you know all this. You know this. I mean, you're the live free or die state. You know that Washington is on a crash course, whether it's financially or whether it's the tyranny that we're seeing candidly from both parties when it comes to the president and the way they wield their pens and tell you how they're going to change everything and do things that presidents heretofore never thought they could do. This is not what we signed up for, if you will. In this Constitution. People talk about, they pull out their pocket Constitution, say, don't change this. Well, it was perfectly written. It was divinely inspired. We don't have any Madisons or Franklins or Jeffersons left in the United States. Well, we may not, but let's just be honest. This document has been changed. It's been changed 27 times. It may have been a perfect document. It was a darn good one. And I would argue that most people think most of the changes are pretty darn good. First 10 amendments, not too many people disagree with those, right? The amendments after the Civil War, not too many people disagree with those. In fact, someone asked the question, well, we don't follow the laws now. Why will we follow them in the future? Look at the amendments. We actually do follow those. We actually follow them pretty darn well. Do we not limit presidents to 2 terms? Yep, we follow that. Do women have the right to vote? Well, I look around here. I'd say the answer is yes. We follow those amendments. Why do we follow them? We follow them because it is darn near impossible to pass an amendment to the Constitution. It's the hardest thing any government, any level of government is required to do to pass anything. The hardest, highest bar is to add an amendment to the Constitution. You need 3/4 of the states. Imagine if you had to get 3/4 of the House here to pass anything. Oh, you'd name a park or two, but anything controversial, no way you're going to get 3/4 of it. And here's the interesting thing. Someone said, well, you only need 13 states for one house of legislature to oppose it. That's wrong. You need 13 states and one house of legislature to do nothing. They don't have to oppose it. They don't have to vote on it. What is the easiest thing? I know some of you are new members, but let me assure you the answer to this question. What is the easiest thing for any legislator to do when it comes to an issue? Nothing. Right? Put it in your drawer. All 13 houses of 13 different states have to do is put it in their drawer. This is darn near impossible. And so in order to pass something, you need broad consensus. If you look at all the amendments that have passed to date, they were overwhelming consensus that this needed to be done. You need 75% of the states. My guess is you need 85% of the public to agree to get 75% of the states to pass. You talk about a runaway convention. A convention simply does one thing. It proposes amendments. Tomorrow, the Congress could propose an amendment to eliminate the First Amendment. They can do it tomorrow. Do you see people running around saying, oh, I'm worried that Congress might propose an amendment that's going to take my rights away? Nobody worries about that. Why? Because it's damn near impossible to pass anything through the legislature. They knew they wouldn't get something like that passed. Do you think folks, after having worked hard to get 34 states to do the three things that Representative Bernardi, who did, by the way, a fabulous job, do you think after working that hard to get a convention, they're going to propose things that have no chance of passing? No, they're going to propose things that have some chance for states that may not be excited about the topics that are at hand might see a way to pass something. I use an example. People say, well, what would that be? Would it be a balanced budget amendment? Maybe. I doubt a balanced budget amendment, candidly, will pass 38 state legislatures at this point. I doubt it. In fact, I greatly doubt it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I don't think it would happen. Do you think, well, then what would happen? The one example I use that I still think could pass, and something that would be very important for the stability of our republic, is to limit the Supreme Court to 9 members. That would prohibit either party from packing the court and trying to do something which I think would be against the interests of our country. I know Democrats may say, well, that's because you have a majority now. Well, that hasn't always been the case. And let me assure you, it won't always be the case. It will swing back and forth, but it will do so gradually over time. And that is the way stability works for America. And I think 38 state legislatures could actually pass that. Would it be worth doing a convention of states just to do that? In my opinion, absolutely yes, for 3 reasons. Number one, the act alone of calling a convention. The founders, remember, had something in common. And people forget this, but it's true. The founders were state legislators. They didn't want the power in the federal government. They knew there needed to be more power, but they didn't want the power to go to the federal government. They wanted it at the states. So they were state legislators, and they focused on one thing. They focused on checks and balances, and particularly checking the federal government becoming a tyrannical body, because they were afraid of that. They came from that. And so they put all these checks in place to make sure that happened. They put 2 particular provisions in that Constitution to protect the states. One was mentioned earlier. You folks used to pick United States senators. Now, as someone who's a United States Senator from Pennsylvania who would never have been picked by my legislature, I'm actually glad that's not the case anymore. But the reality is, it was there so you had a body to check Washington, D.C. from taking your power. The Senate, just so you know, most folks don't know this, but prior to the 17th Amendment in 1912, in order to bring up a bill in the United States Senate, you know what percentage of senators had to agree to bring up a bill just to vote on it? 100%. Do you know what the federal deficit was in 1912 when the 17th Amendment was passed? $1.50 from the Spanish-American War. The federal government, Washington, D.C., was a backwater town that nobody paid much attention to. 17th Amendment came, changed everything. People say, don't touch this Constitution. It has been touched, ladies and gentlemen. It has been touched, and it's been fundamentally changed and shifted the power away from you to Washington. And Washington, D.C. exploded Second thing that happened was court decisions during the New Deal primarily that expanded all of these provisions in the federal Constitution to allow an ever expanding role of government, and that continues. This is not the same Constitution. People wave this around. If you order a Constitution from the General Printing Office in Washington, D.C., do you know how big it is? It's 2,600 pages. That is the Constitution you live by. When people say, don't touch it, it's been touched, folks. This is not 2,600 pages. But the Constitution you live by, which is annotated by Supreme Court decision and amendments, is 2,600 pages. Do you think we might be able to touch that? You think that might be a good idea? And so the reason it's important for you to have this call and to do this convention is to reassert your authority, because the second provision is the one we're talking about, was the provision to allow you to propose amendments. Everybody needs a boss. Everybody needs a check. You are the check to the federal government, and for 250 years, you haven't used it. For 130 years, you didn't need it. You had another check. It was the United States Senate. But for the last 100 years, you have not used the check that was the emergency check. And you can make the argument that up until the last 20 or so years, you didn't need that either. But you do now. You have an obligation because you have power. Spider-Man, right? You're Spider-Man. You have great power. You have great responsibility. I know state legislatures, you're used to being dumped upon by the federal government, everybody telling you how to do things, how to run things. There's one good way to stop it. A good slap beside the head. Hey, bye, we're the Bauer in town with new sheriff. We're going to pass this resolution. We're going to assert our authority rightfully under the Constitution. There are going to be people who say, oh, this is, this under the Article 5 is part of the Constitution. Article 5 is your authority, your responsibility to protect this country. Don't shirk that responsibility because, I'm afraid of a runaway. A runaway what? A runaway convention to propose amendments. Remember, Congress can do it today. So this proposes amendments. And by the way, as for the runaway, because I know that's an important issue, I'm running around, I'll be in South Dakota on Monday. We're going to probably pass South Dakota. It'll be the 20th state. So New Hampshire, you got to get cooking if you want to be 20. So South Dakota will probably pass it next week. We already passed the Senate by a big margin, should pass the House. We have to go around state by state by state to get 34 states to ratify this thing. And we're using the language that you have before you. It's the same language in South Dakota. It was the same in Georgia, which was the first state to pass this, and Arizona and Texas and Florida and a whole bunch of other states have already passed it. It's the same language. Well, why are we bothering to do that? Well, because the language, just like when you pass a bill, it has to be the same in the House and the same in the Senate, or it doesn't become law. Same thing here. It has to be the same in all 34 states, or you don't get a convention called. How do I know that? Because there's been 400 calls for a convention in the history of our country, and we've yet to have a convention. If all you needed was 34 states calling a convention and you can go and do anything, we'd already have a convention. But Congress has never called a convention. Why? Because 34 states haven't agreed on the subject matter that they all agree on to what? Limit the convention. I mean, it just makes sense. If you need 34 states to agree on what the convention's about, that obviously means something at the convention. They're limited by what the call of the convention is for. You had a bill earlier in this discussion talking about faithful delegate. That's a belt and suspender, as the gentleman appropriately said. That's to make sure that your state is following what you as the legislature want, which is limiting to those three topics, at least the ones we're talking about here, and maybe other things that you want to limit to, that they have to vote for this or can't vote for something of this. That's up to you. You control the process. People say, well, we don't know what the rules are. There's no rules set. Well, the reality is there's precedent. I don't know about you, but most legislatures, when they come into session, have to adopt rules. You guys have to adopt rules when you come into session? Okay, well, how do you know what rules to adopt? How do you know what process to use? You have a precedent that when you come in, you do certain things, not in the rules because you don't have any rules, but you have precedent as to how things are done. And you operate by precedent all the time. Well, as was mentioned, there's been 40 conventions of states in the history of our country, and they've all run the same way. There is precedent. There is one state, one vote. How do we know? Because we've had 40 of them, and they've all been one state, one vote. Just like you, before you adopt your rules, that precedent will rule until you have a rules, and then you could change that at the rules. Good luck. There's about 3 times more small states than there are big states as population. You think they're going to give up power to the big states? Let me assure you, New Hampshire's not going to do that. Neither is South Dakota. I know there's a lot of panic around this, and I get it, because with uncertainty and unfamiliarity, people get nervous and they feel like, oh, there's risk. I'm here to try to get you comfortable that this is not a risky thing to do. And in fact, it is an absolutely necessary thing. And it's an absolute abandonment of your responsibility as legislators not to intercede and do an intervention on both parties in Washington, D.C. We need you. And particularly New Hampshire. It's one of the reasons I was so excited to come up here. You folks want to be first in the nation, and you are. You guys want to lead. You want to be the ones who have a oversized weight on what's going on in Washington, D.C. And here, I'm up here pleading with you to do that here. I would think New Hampshire would have been first. Live free or die. Protect our rights as the state. Why aren't you the first to be out here? Both parties.